Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in KAZU, Pacific Grove, California. Now we transfer from bilingual education and language to a subject that requires 10 languages to understand. I don't know what you call that. This is broadcast number 566, and it is October the 11th, 1982. I have an article coming out in the Examiner this next week. I believe it's under the author that I did it with by telephone and tape is Cliff Leindecker. We did a story, was Grace Kelly in danger in the Vatican? Was she a bag woman for the CIA or privy to secrets inside the Vatican that caused her to be killed? That was the gist of the story. I don't know how Cliff will reword it. There's the Globe, the Examiner, the National Enquirer, and the Star. The Globe and the Examiner are owned by the same people. So if you look for that, they go quickly. They're on the stand 1 week, and then that's it. So those of you that can get the article, it will be out this week. I did mention that these programs are taped and transcribed. They go out by subscription to other people, but I want to ask a favor, please. Many people duplicate the tapes. That's fine. If you duplicate them for people, you can even sell them and make a business. You can give them away. There's no copyright. Please copy the bibliography and the sources of information that goes with the broadcast. That makes it more credible. And finally, if you have any question about the spelling, because these broadcasts are transcribed and taped, they're typed up rather, please, if you have a question of a name, telephone me. My telephone is on the top of the sheet that goes out with the cassettes. I'm listed in the book. Write me a letter, but don't copy them or type them up without having the names correct, because if we get the names wrong, then no matter who reads the transcript of it, it doesn't make sense. They can pick up a book and be reading about a different party and not know it's the person that I referred to. For example, some of the foreign names are difficult and my pronunciation isn't the best. Mr. Tisserand, Eugene Cardinal Tisserand, who worked in the Vatican and was involved with scandals with Paul Marcinkus, is not Mr. Tesseran, Tesseran. And Bettino Craxi, the man who works with Licio Gelli in Italy, when it is spelled Kraksy, it makes me look ridiculous and silly. And I've gone to all this work and done all this research to get this information out. So it is of utmost importance that the dates and the names be spelled correctly. Otherwise, there's no use to even send the messages out because they don't even look like the same people. The same way for Francnage. I know that's a hard one. F-E-R-E-N-C-N-A-G-Y, but it doesn't come out Frank Nage, N-A-G-E. They sound like different people, and they read differently, and they sound like Americans and not like Hungarians or Italians, and it's very important to have them absolutely precise, because if they're not precise, there's no point in writing them up, because you can't connect them to the events or future events or anything in the past. So if there's any question, send me your manuscript. If you're writing a paper, a college paper, if you're writing an article, or for a news service, send me the manuscript or call me. I will correct the names, and then it goes out properly. Otherwise, it has absolutely no value, and it is a detriment because it makes me look ridiculous that I don't even know who these people are and get their names all wrong after all that work. Now, this week, I am going to briefly touch on Grace Kelly. I'm not going into the Vatican connections like I did before, but the second half of this broadcast, I will be doing Grace Kelly, 20th Century Fox, and her role as a businesswoman and on the board of Fox, and in Monaco, the woman of the world, other than just the mother role, the image of the saint with the halo that is projected so much. First, I want to say that President Reagan doesn't take any of my advice at all, for sure. I mentioned October the 4th last week that if Nancy and Ronald wanted to declare war on the dope dealers, they should get rid of Senator Paul Laxalt from Nevada, which is the heart of the organized crime skimming money syndicate. Laxalt was the fundraiser for Ronald Reagan when he was president. I said that last Monday, and then the Chicago Tribune had an article Just one day later, Nevada's Laxalt is eyed as the chief fundraiser for the entire Republican Party. So the mob and the mob state will be collecting the money to run the candidates. They're promoting him. The GOP chief, Mr. Richards, resigned. He doesn't like what they're doing and the way they're doing it. So now they're suggesting Paul Laxalt. You know, the problem is if you catch these names way back, you wouldn't be in the trouble we're in today, just as if the investigations of John Connolly and Richard Kleindienst and Paul Marcinkus forging and counterfeiting stocks equal to $1 billion in 1972 wouldn't compound the financial crises today if those guys had been locked up and put in some striped suits behind bars. But because they cover up these things, it compounds, and 10 years later, it's much worse. It is literally a cancer on the economic system. So now the former governor of Nevada, the senator from Nevada, the man who knew Howard Hughes wasn't in Nevada, and I want to do the Hughes-Nevada connections very shortly and compare it next week to taking his fortune that he got when he sold TWA and buying up the hotels and the gaming tables in Vegas to having Grace Kelly die and then the mob coming in from Italy and France and taking over the tables in Monaco. Through kidnapping or killing these particular people, Monaco becomes a second Las Vegas, and this is what's going to happen now that it was bad enough when she was alive, but now it's ripe for the kind of takeover that was done when Howard Hughes was never seen again after Boston, and Paul Laxalt knew when he was the governor of Las Vegas that he wasn't there. So that this man that allowed that entire charade with the assassination teams and the Nazification of America under the Hughes umbrella, he is going to be the fundraiser for the GOP. Anything that comes down, I think people really deserve it. I get so disgusted at the way these people move up in power when they should have been removed a long, long time ago. Now, I have to continue every week with my update on Fritz Kraemer, my running account of Fritz Kraemer, and precisely I want to read a letter I wrote to the members in Congress, the Subcommittee on Immigration, Refugees, and International Law. A subscriber to World Watcher sent me the names of the members of that committee, and if you write to me with a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll give you their names because there's 7 of them and you wouldn't remember them if I ran them down on the air so fast. They're having hearings on the illegal allowing of Nazi criminals into the United States after World War II, done by Richard Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller and Mr. Wiesner of the CIA, who conveniently commits suicide at one point, not a while back. But the committee in the Congress is supposed to look into the matter. And I wrote a letter, 7 letters today, and this is what I have enclosed, and the letter is self-explanatory for those of you that don't keep up with my Kraemer versus Kraemer every week. Dear, and then the members of the Congress that I addressed to the individuals. Enclosed is a picture of Nazi war criminal Fritz Kraemer, prisoner number 33 at the Dachau trials in December 1964. And I gave each of them a picture of Fritz Kraemer with number 33 hanging over his chest, his breastplate. Secondly, enclosed is the front page magazine section from the Washington Post, March 2nd, 1975, about F.G. Fritz Kraemer, who was the man who was the plans officer for the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. So they have a picture of a Fritz Kraemer, Hitler's Kraemer, in the seat, and our Kraemer, who runs a Pentagon here. Third, the Fritz Kraemer, who became the plan officer for the Chief of Staff of U.S. Army, and I gave his serial numbers, both of them, served overseas in 1944 to 1945 in Scotland, England, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. For I request that your committee investigating Nazis entering the United States after World War II, illegally entering, interview Fritz Gustav Anton Kraemer and find out if they are the same person, Hitler's Kraemer and our Chief of Staff at the Pentagon. 3, if they are not the same person, and if this Kraemer says he is not, therefore they don't have to see him, how is it that Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kraemer is not in a single history book of World War II after the 1964 trials. The Dachau-Malmedy trials are in very few books. The Dachau trials are mentioned in 1 out of every 3,000 books on the history of Germany and Nazism. If this is not the same Kraemer, where did the other Fritz Kraemer, Hitler's, go after his number 33 sign came off at Dachau? Please locate the source information on the other one. The United States Fritz Kraemer refuses to be photographed, even though he made the most important military decisions and appointments since World War II. 1. Are these the same man? 2. If they are not, why is the United States Kraemer hiding? 3. If they are not, where did the other one go? And 4, if they are the same, he entered the country illegally because he was a war criminal. Get him out. Sincerely, Mae Brussell. Now, a friend who listens to these broadcasts, a world watcher, has been trying to obtain information on Hitler's Kraemer after the Dachau trials, and he went to the library system to mow back, and this is the answer he got on that matter. Sorry to report that I have not been able to find any biographical or current information on Fritz Kraemer other than what you have already found. References of his importance in the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's right-hand man, Hitler depended on him, and his entering and orchestrating with Mr. Dietrich and Piper the Battle of the Bulge and the Malmedy massacres. The Moback said, the massacre at Malmedy has not been on the bookshelf of the library for the last 2 months. It's written by Charles Whiting. It hasn't been on 2 months, so we can assume it is missing. The only information I can find that might be helpful is a page from a book, Uncertain Judgment, a bibliography of war crime trials by John Lewis. It has more sources of information. The items checked I looked at, they do not have anything about Fritz Kraemer among the war criminals. One of them, the Senate hearing on the U.S. Army mistreatment of the German defendants, did have some testimony of Kraemer at the time that he had heard of mistreatment but was not mistreated himself. The hearing was held in Munich in 1949. It is possible that Kraemer got out before 1956. I know he got out. I want to know if he was in the Pentagon in 1948. I have checked all that we have on current and old German biographical directories. This is the entire library system for California, MOBAC. Okay, maybe it's national, but this is in California. They put it through the computers. We have checked the old German biographical directories and books on the Third Reich that include biographical material with no luck. If the patron wants to do more serious research, they should use the Hoover Institute for War and Peace at Stanford, but I have my doubts about finding information on the current whereabouts of Fritz Kraemer. We'll close now, and there is no way for the MOBAC to find a man whose picture I have at the Dachau trials, who was there but disappears completely, yet our American Kraemer is not visible. Now, another person who is a world watcher that subscribes to these tapes and has been assisting me tremendously in Minneapolis sent me an article of a reunion in Minneapolis last week titled Former Enemies Find Common Memories of the GI German Reunion. Now, this is about the boys from Company G meeting at the Sheraton Ritz Hotel in Minneapolis, from World War II veterans from the United States Army 70th Infantry Division, and how these people met with Germans, and they quote one Erich Meyer from West Germany. The Germans that come to the reunion, these are men who fought in the Battle of the Bulge at Malmedy, Americans, and they meet with Germans from the 6th SS Mountain Division. Now, that was Mr. Piper's division, and worked directly with Adolf Hitler, and Otto Skorzeny's division, and of course all of them worked with the Republican Party and the CIA and Reinhard Gehlen and Alan Dawes after the war. And this article goes into the fact how they are friends now. We have reunions. They met back in Germany, the 70th Division. The Americans greet me with open hearts, the Germans said. The 70th Division has been holding reunions for 10 years and invites veterans from the 6th SS Division. Now, that's the Fritz Kraemer, Adolf Hitler, Himmler Special, Otto Skorzeny, the group that were going to take the world for the Fourth Reich and make the Reich live forever. Now, the catch about this reunion, they say they don't have anything against each other. They like each other. The more you see these guys, the Germans, the more you realize they're just GIs and we're GIs. And attention was called by the person who sent me this article that there was no 70th Division in Malmedy at the trial. I got out my books on the history of the Battle of the Bulge. There is no 70th Division. In the book, The Damned Engineers, it lists the U.S. Army infantry divisions going from the 30th to the 82nd to the 84th. In another book, The Battle of the Bulge by John Pimlett, there are various divisions of 1st, 2nd, 4th, 26th, 30th to the 75th. There is none. And then I got out the 700-page book of the Army history, the official history of the U.S. Army, that mentions Fritz Kraemer, Hitler's Kraemer, as chief of staff of this Bulge operation one time, just one sentence. And these are 7 volumes or 10 volumes of World War II, and 700 pages are on the Battle of the Bulge. And in that index of the infantry divisions, there is the 35th, the 66th, and the 75th. There is, in no official literature, a history of the 70th. So what we're having here is a meeting of the top SS Panzer divisions of the echelon who are described in books like The Nazis Go Underground, who want Hitler to win this war once and for all through World War III and sabotaging America, meeting with these various characters annually or twice annually now, who can exchange as spies against America. They love each other. They have nothing against each other. The more you're around these guys, the Germans, the more you realize they're just like us. They are new comrades. The 70th, which is non-existent, that may have been put together as an excuse to bring the 6th SS Panzer Division to the United States for these reunions every 2 years and go to Germany. They created their own group that is friendly with the other group. And at the time of that terrible battle, Otto Skorzeny was providing American uniforms and English-speaking Americans from out of the American Army who were actually Germans to sabotage and prolong the war so that Martin Bormann could get the money and the art and the gold and the jewels out of Europe in Red Cross trucks to get ready for World War III. And in case you're not familiar with the Battle of the Bulge, which turns out to me to be the turning point of American history, and it's described as such in several books, the United States Army lost 29,493 people from December 15th to January 28th. In 45 days, there were 29,493 dead, only 8,000 or more coffins, and 21,000 missing when the snow melted and so forth that were never accounted for. And the Germans had 12,652 dead. In 45 days, the Americans had 46,000 wounded, 29,000 plus dead. One of the most dangerous battles because the orders were kill everyone in sight, don't have any survivors. And now some 70th Division is meeting with Hitler's SS Panzer Division while Martin Bormann is very much alive, still funding these operations through IG Farben in South America. Now to get to IG Farben, I suppose I can't pass up the Tylenol story. Just a few moments. I didn't discuss it last week. And in essence, I think there was a story in the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm not going to repeat all the news, getting to the Tylenol, and it isn't far from the other story. Fear of sabotage, Tylenol repercussions. This was October the 5th, 1982. Tylenol was described as one of the most successful consumer products ever made. It captured 37% of the market. The sabotage of a widely used product like Tylenol carries the risk of huge costs, loss of sales, damage of confidence. That is Johnson & Johnson. And the big competitor for the painkiller is IG Farben's Bayer Aspirin. There are many books on IG Farben you can get, but a good one that's available is Crime and Punishment, IG Farben by Joseph Borken, published by Macmillan in 1978. And Borgen died just at the time this book came out. He had been fighting IG Farben all of his life, and on the eve of the book being published, he was dead. On page 5 of that book, he tells how in 1903, Farben made their plans with Bayer to open their factories in New York City, the pharmaceutical and the dye stuff. They created the first gas that was used by the German army out of the Bayer laboratories to be used against Russian troops. The Germans introduced poison gas made by I.G. Farben and Bayer that shook the military foundation of the Allied armies. And then, of course, during World War II, Zyklon B was made by Otto Ambros, who is now working and has been for our energy department, and under Ronald Reagan is getting promoted with his cohorts like J. Peter Grace in cabinet positions. Now, in page 283 in the book, The Crime and Punishment of I.G. Farben, they express their desire to expand their business, double it, at least double it in the next few years. And this book came out in 1978. The United States, of course, is the major market for their aspirins and Bayer AG. They have plans for a $1 billion expansion in the United States within 5 to 10 years. Well, that was 1978, and this is only 1982, and their biggest competitor is literally bleeding. If Bayer caused your stomach to bleed, their competitor, Johnson & Johnson, is bleeding economically. The Bayer decided through their various subsidiaries that they would expand and double the American expansion program. Well, if you have a plan for a $1 billion expansion, you certainly could put a little cyanide, which is a German weapon, into a few bottles of Tylenol and ruin your competitor. I mean, you don't even need your $1 billion expansion. They did more to aspirin in 1 week and to hurt their competitor. And as the Chronicle said, there's a fear of sabotage. The book on Farben says the three multinationals assure permanent prosperity for the original 450 Farben stockholders, their banks, and the shadowy shareholders of the Martin Bormann organization in South America, who guard and vote with Hermann Schmidt's trust fund through intermediaries at the annual meeting of Bayer Aspirin. So Martin Bormann votes. He has an interest. He's a shareholder. His organization is a shareholder. And why would they let Bayer Aspirin go down the drain? Now, the headlines you saw this weekend on the news with hysteria, just a few of them: more than one killer, a new theory, clues fade, strychnine-laced tainted Tylenol in Oroville, California, poison bottles found in California, another death linked to cyanide, extortion plots, 100 agents look for killer, FBI seeks a madman, a crazed man, another Lee Harvey Oswald type, you see, 100 searching for random murderers. Tylenol, then another headline, sells best of all pain relievers. Another article, the tragedy could end Tylenol's success. Another headline, psychologists offer the profile of the killer, an alienated loner seen most likely as Tylenol poisoner. I didn't have time this week. I wish I had time to take the headlines and stories of the swine flu and the Legionnaire's disease and just change the name and read them to you and say it's the Tylenol scare. It's the same pulp. It's the same script writers that covered the John Kennedy murder, the Robert Kennedy, the Martin Luther King. It's the same I.G. Farben and Martin Bormann down in Argentina and Uruguay and Paraguay and the whole Nazi network, the Mengele gang. And again, if you don't check out Paul Axalt in 1966 when Hughes goes to Vegas, if you don't check out Martin Bormann in South America, if you don't check out I.G. Farben, you got to pay your dues later. And this kind of industrial sabotage was noted by John Kennedy. If you get the New York Times article, April 28th, 1966, you can go to the library. It's on microfilm. They ran a series exposing the CIA. And the idea of this article, it says JFK was annoyed at the CIA. He was not only annoyed, he was furious that they were using chemical warfare and altering crops that Fidel Castro had that were going to the Soviet Union. August 22nd, 1962, there was chemical, biological warfare injected into the sugar that these people would receive. The director of the CIA was John McCone, who lives out here at Pebble Beach. He was director when John Kennedy was murdered. He worked for Bechtel McCone. He went over to the security, the atomic energy, and headed that. He became CIA director. As I said before, he brought in the Nazis like von Braun, Werner von Braun, and Walter Dornberger. John McCone was the director of the CIA. This year he was knighted by the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Vatican secret society that I referred to over and over again. His CIA was poisoning the crops, and JFK was furious. And JFK said, and it's quoted in the New York Times, it would set a terrible precedent for chemical sabotage in the undeclared back alley struggle between the East and West. Now, if you can have a chemical sabotage in the back alley struggle between the East and West, you can have it between Bayer and Johnson & Johnson. You can wipe out any competitor anytime you want, because chemical, biological sabotage is more important, in my mind, even than we worry about the atomic bombs. We talk about whole cities and people being wiped out. But individually, people are being poisoned in food, crops are being ruined. We can have this horrendous fear of what we eat, what we touch. We can get competitors knocked out of the box. And when John Kennedy was complaining about this, was McCone fired? No, if McCone had been fired, he wouldn't be CIA director when Kennedy was murdered, and covered that up also. Kennedy fired Allen Dulles from the CIA because he didn't trust him. He said there's a hidden government behind his back, and the president said, and it's in this article too, he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. Well, there's a difference between wanting it and doing it. He should have done it that day. You can do anything you want if you want to. You can declare war. You can end war. You can splinter the place up. He should have kicked McCone out when Castro's crops. It doesn't matter who it is, because if it's Castro tomorrow, it's your food today. And he objected, and the sugar was already doctored. And there was a high-level political decision that was taken to sabotage the Cuban economy. And the point of the article was that the president doesn't even know, and that there is the preeminent concern whether the CIA, despite its disclaimers to the contrary, does on occasion make policy. Yeah, it makes policy, and it makes poison. And it makes poison that people will just swallow when they have a headache. And today it's that. It was Kool-Aid with the same poison that was put, the cyanide, the Nazi poison that was put down in Jonestown. Tomorrow it'll be the waterworks of an entire city, like Los Angeles. It depends. 3 million people or so depend on one water system. So it's a problem that isn't going to go away. And because it wasn't handled properly, Kennedy could have gotten rid of those very people and the chemists that put the stuff into the sugar. He should have just stopped government contracts with him. I mean, he's going to die anyway. He didn't know it. But if you're going to die for something. He died for a lot of things. He was shot for a lot of reasons. But the point is, why allow the same CIA director to go on? If you have poisoned crops that are going to arrive somewhere else and a whole boatload is injected just with one little needle or whatever, and the stuff goes bad, get rid of that person if you don't believe in it. You can't have an instrument or an organization like that and not believe in it, and believe that it's not going to do to you what it does to those crops. So in that sense, if you don't take care, as I said, Paul lacks salt, if you don't take care of the poisoning of food, then whatever comes down later, if you don't take care of Fritz Kraemer, now you're going to end up with Fritz Kraemer's protege, Henry Kissinger, as the Minister of Propaganda. He's just been given a big job with ABC Broadcasting on the news, and he's on the board of directors of 20th Century Fox that we're going into in 1 minute, Henry Kissinger's role. And the CBS has just put up a huge multi-million-dollar fund for 20th Century Fox with no interest paid, so that they get Henry Kissinger on CBS and they get Henry Kissinger on ABC. And the Minister of Propaganda, Fritz Kraemer's protege, that Nazi rat, gets promoted to carry our news stories and influence the news media. So if you don't weed out these people, you get worse than weeds later, and it really is a tragedy. Now, we're going to take a 1-minute break here. I'm going to stop. Now, we will go to side 2 of this broadcast. This is number 566, October the 11th. It's 1982, and this is the second broadcast on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove. Last week, I talked about the dangerous connections of Grace Kelly in the Vatican. I'm not going into those, as I said before. There were 10 important stories that I was going to do, but I'm going to push them aside until next week. One is a warning in the LA Times about the Opus Dei. That's that group inside the Vatican linked to Roberta Calvi and to Licio Gelli, and the intrigues going on that is described as a cancer on the church, the most dangerous malignant growth that is occurring. And I've talked about it. We'll get back to it. In Argentina, there was a murder down there, an important murder of a person who works with the military junta, but allegedly was from the left. It's that marriage of left and right, again, that I want to go into. The Argentine press has stopped all TV and news coverage of Licio Gelli and the scandal of the secret Masonic Lodge and their death threats to news media people if they talk. Roberta Calvi's wife has insisted they open up the investigation of his death. He was murdered in London. It was not suicide. There are a lot of articles on arrests of right-wing terrorists that were disguised as left, one of my favorite subjects, murders related to the Vatican and the banks last week, and more scandals. But I'm going to shelve those and go into the second side, Grace Kelly and 20th Century Fox. Grace Kelly, the businesswoman, I was talking about the web around her. There's an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about some people who were in Monaco when she died, and they were asking questions about the accident and the situations of the car or her body or the discrepancies. And then the person writing the Philadelphia Inquirer said, does that matter very much what they ask? How much did they ever know about Grace Kelly? In other words, don't bother yourself about the details. You didn't know anything and you won't know more. So forget it. It's all speculation on your part. We don't know very much about her. Now, Forbes had an interesting article this past week about Grace Kelly, and Forbes magazine, of course, is a business magazine. It's like it's equivalent to the Wall Street Journal, only it comes out not as often, and it's a magazine. It's called The FAIRYTALE Business, and this article tells how her vision of Monaco was a very successful as an executive, and in the last 26 years, the gambling casino, the SBM, the nickname, the initials for it, Société de Bain de Mer, that company owns Monaco's major hotels and the casinos, and she was very serious about working with the company. They said her only visible business role, was as a member of the 20th Century Fox board. The company was taken over by Denver oil man Marvin Davis in 1981. But Princess Grace had a lot of influence. Forbes magazine said her interest in SBM in Monaco, according to their reports, dated virtually from the moment of her wedding, with good reason. Last week I talked about her Rockefeller connections, her model connections like Candy Jones or Jerry Ford, the MGM, Herbert Hoover connections, and I'll go into details of those each week, some other parts of it. She was interested in controlling the tables, of easing Aristotle Onassis out. You notice his son was murdered, a fellow still in jail for murdering his son. Onassis died. The empire crumbled, and Onassis was sabotaged by Robert Mayhew and the Las Vegas syndicate working under, again, with the Howard Hughes people, the CIA. They sabotaged for the Saudi Arabian oil transport. They wanted to ease out Aristotle Onassis, and Grace has worked with that team ever since she's been over there. She worked with the group. They were in charge of the hotels, the casinos, the opera houses, the restaurants, the discotheques. And the fiscal year ended in July. There was $90 million with a profit of $1.8 million. Everybody's losing. They were ahead. And this is about the business savvy, that the article says there will be trouble because even before her sudden death, there were hints that all was not well in the magical kingdom. Bernard Combermale, who was Combemale, if you want the spelling, Bernard Combemale, who was brought in from Philadelphia to upgrade the Monaco tables and casinos in 1978, has deserted the ship and has been replaced by André Saint-Melux, M-L-E-U-X, a longtime minister of state and crony of Prince Rainier's. So things weren't going well in the business world. She was in it from the minute she married. She jumped right into it. You have this image of, the mother with the kids on the breast. All I want to be is a good mother, sitting home taking care of the kiddies. She was a businesswoman, and as I say, the visible role was at 20th Century Fox, and she also had to be a pretty tough bind to be running around with the Monaco gaming tables and that international crowd that's over there in Monte Carlo. Another article in Forbes which just about describes the scene. This was January the 21st, 1980, at the time that Grace Kelly was on the board of 20th Century Fox, and also Mr. Rogers, the attorney for the Shah of Iran, was on the board at 20th Century Fox. They really had a who's who, and I won't go down all the board members now. Mr. Stanfield, the Fox chairman at the time, said, and this is a large heading in Forbes magazine, If 20th Century Fox's recent management upheaval were filmed, it would be too bloody for your kids to see. Never mind, says Chairman Stanfield, think of the message. And Stanfield was chairman. He was a graduate at Annapolis in the class of Jimmy Carter, and he was telling about the purchase of 20th Century Fox. It would be too bloody for your kids to see. Think of the message, and he warned. Now, the takeover of 20th Century Fox was described August the 2nd, 1981. On the board came Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for the John Hinckley family, and for Robert Vesco, and for John Connolly and Richard Helms, and the Mullen Associates that covered the Watergate gang. Remember that out of Colorado came Marvin Davis, who bought 20th Century Fox. In Colorado lives James McCord, who set up a planned military coup for the country. And out of Colorado come some interesting characters. And the attorney, the common denominator for the mob, for the CIA, for this business clique is Edward Bennett Williams. And then the LA Times, in this one article, the August the 2nd, 1981, and I might have had this a long time ago when they came over and took the Pebble Beach area and bought that up. They listed Kirk Kerkorian, Princess Grace of Monaco, and a who's who of the business world. But Grace is listed among these men, the only woman among this gang of thieves and whatever you want to call them. Another article that I did mention a while back, I think broadcast 502, Henry Kissinger was put on the board of 20th Century Fox, along with Edward Bennett Williams. Gerald Ford was already appointed a close friend of Marvin Davis, and Ford is also director of GK Technologies in Great Britain, Tiger Industries, the Flying Tiger, Santa Fe Industries that was bought by Kuwait over in, the Kuwait scandal that I want to get into, Shearson Loeb Rhodes and Amex, and he's also on the Warner, and other board of directors are great. Former president who was on the Warren Commission. Now, all these people touch bases when Kennedy was murdered, and they're still in the news today. Another important article in the New York Times, Fox's Dollars and Cents Allure, and it tells about 20th Century Fox. They own Pebble Beach Corporation. They own Pebble Beach Lodge, 3 famous golf courses, the Del Monte Forest, a total of 2,500 acres of land, most of it in Pebble Beach, the rest in Monterey and outlying areas. These are the people that have the control of our little area out here, if that feels very comfortable. I mean, they are really the who's who of what has been going on in espionage for the last 30 years and covering up the particular assassinations that I've been studying. Another article, now this is Grace's companion. These are her companions. That's why I mention this. Another article in the Los Angeles Times about Marvin Davis and Frank Sinatra, because Frank has always been very close to Grace Kelly, not just when they made a movie and she went to Europe, but ever since. It had nothing to do with the 20th Century Fox when she was on the board. He still has kept close contact with Grace, and he had close contact with Marvin Davis. There's an article, Old Blue Eyes Taking Turn for Charity, and it tells about his long contact and association with Marvin Davis and how he was going to raise money for their favorite charities and sing for them. And the Davises were among those present when Sinatra gave a small sit-down dinner in Palm Springs to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Princess Grace and Frank Sinatra. So their contacts have kept up. Now, this last week, 20th Century Fox, the corporation we're talking about, that she was on the board, ran into a little bit of trouble. It may be into a lot of trouble, but the trouble only got to be exposed because they were investigating the murder of a lawyer from 20th Century Fox. One article in the Monterey Herald, 20th Century Fox president quits company. Grace died on the 15th of September. And October the 6th, the 20th Century Fox Film Company will get a new top executive. The president, C. Joseph Labonte, big L, small a, capital B-O-N-T-E. Labonte is deserting the company for personal reasons. And Jerry announced Jerry Greenberg. Fox is the parent company of Pebble Beach. The owner, Marvin Davis, announced that Gerald Bergman, a Fox director who once worked in Fox's largest lending, Continental Illinois National Bank, has been appointed executive vice president. So while Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger and Madame Chennault and Grace Kelly are associated with 20th Century Fox and with Frank Sinatra and so forth. The largest lender was Continental, Illinois, a bank that has recently lost several hundreds of millions. I have the figures here, and it's hard to tell exactly how much because there's so many discrepancies. But they were involved in the Drysdale scandal with the Chase Manhattan, with the Oklahoma, the Penn Bank, and also they were the lending bank for Cardinal Cody with his $1 million fund. He conveniently got a heart attack and died before that was investigated. He had a woman in Florida going back and forth just as Mr. Bloomingdale did, Alfred Bloomingdale, Cardinal Cody from Chicago. His funds were tied up with the Continental, Illinois, as was Michael Sindona, the banker for the Vatican who's serving time in jail and wanted for 5 murders. They were all working in this particular bank, and an executive from the Continental, Illinois, who was a director of 20th Century Fox, is going to be the vice president, announced this week. The change came. The president resigned. The new vice president from the Continental, Illinois, who supplies the money for Fox, the change came because the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office is investigating Fox for possible misappropriation of funds. Company officials said they will cooperate. They are missing maybe as much as $1 million. Well, in my research, I found that whenever they say $1 million, it goes up to 9 or 10. If they say 10, it's 20. And if there's 20 million missing, it's 50 million. So let's start with $1 million. But the point is that Grace has been affiliated with all these people. As soon as she dies, the president resigns. The bank that funded the organization that she was on the board is collapsing and tangled into scandals of murder, missing millions, and you name it. Another article, Los Angeles Times, along these lines. District Attorney's Office and the studio clash on a financial probe. 20th Century Fox accused the Los Angeles Police Department and the District Attorney's Office of a witch hunt. They claim there are irregularities, and Burton Monash, M-O-N-A-S-C-H, Executive Vice President of 20th Century Fox, asserted that a special entertainment task force has been set up by District Attorney John Vandekamp because they have received information of hanky-panky at Fox Studio. The furor began when the Hollywood Reporter printed a story about a producer, Daniel Melnick, M-E-L-N-I-C-K, involved with financial irregularities. And the Entertainment Task Force is looking into possible misappropriation of funds, embezzlement of funds. You know, a new book just came out about these problems over Columbia Studio. And when that story broke with the Columbia Studios executives, 2 of them went to 20th Century Fox, and Begelman and Kerkorian were MGM. And they split between those 2 studios, and now those 2 studios are having problems. So again, I go back to the point, whether it's Paul Exeld in Nevada or Kennedy with the crops and the spoiling chemically of food and products to break a nation, or whether it's a corporation, or Fritz Kraemer, if he's Hitler's Kraemer and he's running our Pentagon. If you find something and you don't follow it to the nth degree till you're absolutely satisfied that they can't function, if you don't lock them up, make sure they don't function, continuing what they did before, you just know that you have to have trouble later. Now, the LA Times story, October the 1st, 1982, goes into the refusal of Fox to cooperate unless they get a subpoena. And the man that they're concerned about, this Mr. Melnick, he's an independent producer that briefly, he came over there and signed a private contract with Fox, but briefly he was president of Columbia Pictures. In 1978, he was appointed to that post by Chairman Alan Hirschfeld, who left Columbia and went to 20th Century and took Melnick with him. Hirschfeld is now chairman of 20th Century Fox. Okay, now when they went to investigate this case, they had trouble. It said at the end of Melnick's contract with Fox Studio, they were investigating the case when Norman Garey, the attorney for Mr. Melnick, died. Now, this article says it was a self-inflicted gunshot wound on August the 18th. Another case like Global Resources, Global International Resources, or many of the subjects I've been talking about, when the investigation goes, you get either an apparent heart attack or an apparent suicide by a gunshot. Okay, the gun's in their hand and they're dead. Now, Mr. Monash is vice president of 20th Century Fox. Marvin Davis owns it. Daniel Melnick has been suggested for financial irregularities. He was formerly president of Columbia when they were having financial irregularities. Alan Hirschfield was chairman of Columbia and left and went to Fox. Now, when they're going into the story, August the 18th, this Norman Garey dies of a bullet wound just at the height of the investigation, or when it's beginning. Now, they were working out contracts, and there was question about money or hanky-panky at the Fox. Now, interestingly enough, this article says this Mr. The attorney that was shot, Norman Garey, was the attorney for Gene Hackman and also Marlon Brando. Now, Marlon Brando made the formula at MGM. That was the story about I.G. Farben. This is his attorney who's now dead. And Gene Hackman is the son of Mary Martin. And if you remember, a few weeks ago, I did a program on October the 4th. No, it was a little earlier that on the suspicious circumstances on the death of Mary Martin not the death, she lived. The death, her best friend died, her business manager and best friend died. She almost died. The accident that I felt, there's more to it than meets the eye. This was September 13th, 1982. I talked about the mysterious circumstances about the car crash, about Mary Martin. And curiously enough, and it doesn't prove anything at all, but the man who ran into them comes from Denver, Colorado, and the car he used was a Mr. Mueller in Colorado. And we're talking about an area where the heads of all the group that we're talking, the money and the funds come out of Denver, Colorado. And the guy who crashed the car that ran into Mary Martin and Janet Gaynor and killed her business manager was a longtime associate of a Mueller, a Mr. Mueller, who lives in Colorado. Another interesting connection to this saga that I don't want to get too complicated, but on August the 18th, this attorney for Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando and for Mr. Melnick at 20th Century Fox, I went to enter that date into a calendar where I keep dates because they do overlap, and we'll call them coincidentally until we know better. But on that exact date is when the two insurance men disappeared from Los Angeles that I described on this air October the 4th. The insurance executives, the sleazy outfit, our treasurer tax collector here, Thomas White III, and I put on the printed sheet that goes with the tapes, check him out, that these insurance executives, that he gave an open-ended account at Wells Fargo in Monterey, California, disappeared. One car was found at the airport, and one was in a driveway. They haven't been seen since. They absconded with funds from banks, from investments, mostly in Los Angeles, of accident insurance, but there was an open-ended fund up here in Monterey. Those guys took a powder, and remember that the investment up here, there's Pebble Beach Corporation that we're talking about, these people, and related to our tax collector here. I can't say exactly what this means, but these men that absconded with over $400,000 in Los Angeles were handling accounts of the tax collector up here in Pebble Beach, Monterey area. And at the same time, that same day, a man who represents Marvin Davis, who owns Pebble Beach, was murdered. An attorney was killed in Los Angeles. Now, in the process of investigating his death, and they're reopening it again, they came into these problems of the missing money. And as I say, the president of 20th Century Fox stepped down, and the new vice president is a man from Continental, Illinois, and Chicago. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner had an article September 30th, the DA task force to question Fox on rumor of mishandled funds. It's sort of like a deja vu of the Columbia Studios, but it's the same people shifting around and bringing in new characters. But you see, when you're working with Frank Sinatra and Anna Chennault and Henry Kissinger and Jerry Ford and Grace Kelly and this combine, they shouldn't have any problems of this kind at all. And the man who left the corporation said, the company was too bloody for your children to see. He said, he warned in Forbes, just watch, what I'm saying and see what happens. The Herald describes, the reporter wrote that Melnick attributed the start of the rumor of his trouble to people that were trying to find the answer to Norman Garey's death with those who couldn't understand why I left Fox. That's a quotation and from the Herald-Examiner. And again, this is the crowd Besides Grace being tangled in the Vatican, I could do 10 consecutive weeks of how she fits into all these other pieces of the puzzle. The reporter wrote that Melnick from the studio attributed the start of the rumor of the missing money and the $1 million and the kickbacks between writers and producers that occurred, or contracts negotiated in a conspiracy to embezzle funds from the company. This was written and attributed to the start of the rumor based on the coupling of people who were trying to find the answer to Norman Garey's death, Garey, with those who couldn't understand why I left Fox, his attorney. Another story, Burton Monash, Monsch, is furious, 20th Century Fox. He is furious that they are investigating the $1 million in studio funds that disappeared, the kickbacks, the conspiracy to embezzle funds from the company. Burton Monash, the executive vice president, is totally outraged. So that the attorney who passed away has these famous clients, Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman, and also that organization is involved with people up here on the peninsula. They own the peninsula. Another important story from the Los Angeles Times this week that makes it even larger and weirder. 20th Century Fox gives Jay Emmett an office in New York as courtesy. This is October the 6th, Los Angeles Times. Jay Emmett, a former top executive of Warner Communications, where Jerry Ford's on the board, who pleaded guilty last year to federal charges of transporting stolen checks, is working as a consultant in the New York office of 20th Century Fox Film. Now, I mean, get this picture. The lawyer's dead. These people are disappearing. A man has pleaded guilty to this kind of work, federal charges, transporting stolen checks, and he's used as a consultant at 20th Century Fox in New York. When on the board are our big super spies, the protege of Fritz, Kraemer, Henry Kissinger, Gerald Ford from the Warren Commission, Anna Chennault from the narcotics of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam, and close ties to Frank Sinatra and Princess Grace. The article says Mr. Emmett is performing specialized consulting for 20th Century Fox, although it's unclear with whom he is doing the consulting work. Emmett does not have a firm deal with Fox. Emmett was connected with the office of Alan Hirschfield, the company's chairman and chief executive, a secretary said. He's working in the New York office. Emmett, 54, is waiting sentencing. He pleaded guilty in February 1981 to 2 counts of transporting stolen checks. The government dropped 10 other counts, including the acceptance of cash bribes and diversion of $156,000 in Warner funds to the now defunct Westchester Premier Theater in Tarrytown, New York. Now that gets into Frank Sinatra and the mob syndicate, and I could do a whole broadcast on the Westchester area and the drugs and the banking scandals going on in Westchester. So that he was brought in on those charges, pleaded guilty, 10 charges were dropped, and maybe next week I'll read an article. There was an Overthrow magazine, parts of it, The Rat in the Pack Comes Back, and it's about Frank Sinatra and Spiro Agnew and Ronald Reagan, a picture of him putting on the inaugural ball for Ronald Reagan, and this goes into the Westchester Theater, the Premier Theater, and the mob connections of Frank Sinatra and the mob. So here is a company that's being investigated at a time that he's pleaded guilty, and they have him in the office in New York City. Leonard Horowitz, a former vice president of the theater, pleaded guilty to 2 charges of tax evasion. A third official, Solomon Weiss, an assistant treasurer of the New York-based Warner, is due to go on trial. He's accused of helping conduct a pattern of racketeering activities at the firm. Now, this guy is in New York City working for 20th Century Fox, okay? The government contains that the Warner officials took bribes from the Westchester Premier Theater and in return caused the Warner to buy stock in the theater company, violating the fiduciary duty to Warner. The theater owners were accused of looting the theater's revenue, causing it to go into bankruptcy. Now, here's 20th Century Fox being investigated using the same people. It doesn't make sense to me. Maybe it makes sense to you. I don't know how these corporations run. Emmett was one of the 3 members of the Warner's Office of the President. He resigned from the company after he pleaded guilty. He's working for them now. Now, another story, if that isn't enough. Los Angeles Times. Fox Studio reports a loss and blames their film division Fox Studio, which was bought by Marvin Davis, this is July 14th, 1982, operates as a subsidiary of David's private company, the TCF Holding Company, and they also have some very mysterious entanglements in the Antilles that I once did a broadcast on. Although Fox is a privately held company, it is required to make quarterly disclosures to the Security Exchange. Fox's leading banker is Continental Illinois National Trust in Chicago. Now, if you want a little background on, again, connecting Grace Kelly to the Vatican and Ronald Reagan and Michael Sindona, get the book The Final Conclave by Malachi Martin. I've had it on the air many, many times. And Michael Sindona, who's in jail for 25 years for breaking many, many banks, I can give you the amount and the names of them, The Final Conclave has them, was directly linked with David Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Secretary of the Treasury, to the Continental Illinois. That's as well as the Vatican's Cardinal Cody. January 9th, 1952, the Swiss authorities closed Sindona's Finabank. It had sustained foreign exchange losses of $82 million. He lost $45 million at the Franklin National, $82 million from his Finabank, and there isn't even enough time. There's 2 minutes left for the list of money that was gone. $150 million from another bank, and his Swiss banks collapsed. But Michael Sindona used David Kennedy, an executive of the Continental in Illinois. 20th Century Fox gets funded of them. Michael Sindona worked closely. He was a banker investment for the Vatican. And as I mentioned last week, Princess Grace's introduction and arrangement for her marriage was made by the Vatican. She knew all these characters. She knows them now. The ones that are dead, she'll see in heaven. The ones that were alive, she worked with. I don't have time to continue the story of 20th Century Fox, the Continental Illinois, the chicanery going on there. I'll have to stop because I have 1 minute. But I think you get the picture. We've done 1 week, a half hour on Princess Grace in the Vatican. Now you get a little picture of the board of directors of 20th Century Fox, the kind of high society she kept. I call that high society. And next week, I'll do a half hour more on Grace and the syndicate and the mob, the comparison to the takeover of the Monte Carlo tables now with the Howard Hughes empire in Vegas when they moved in 1966. In the meanwhile, the hour is up. You do your homework, read some books, send me articles on Kraemer or all these different subjects. I appreciate them. I'm getting a lot of new articles every week, and I'll be back with you. This is Mae Brussell, and this is KAZU in Pacific Grove, California.